We are now about to head into the month of November of the 2024 college football season. I was asking myself a few minutes ago, what did things look like 10 years ago at this time? More specifically, what the heck was going on in the SEC back in early November of 2014? Well, in today's video, we are going to answer that exact question, as we're going to go back in time 10 years and talk about how each and every SEC team was doing at this point in the 2014 season. The video is pretty self-explanatory, but before we get started, if you're a big fan of college football, be sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a like if you want to support today's video, and let me know what player, team, topic, or situation I can cover next. Now let's get started and talk about what every SEC team looked like 10 years ago. Okay, so the first team we're going to start out with is the Kentucky Wildcats. Going all the way back to 2014, by the time we arrived at November 1st, the Wildcats were 5-3 and they were 2-3 in the SEC. They were fresh off of a loss to number 1 Mississippi State, and at the time they were led by Patrick Towles at quarterback, Stanley Boom Williams at running back, and Ryan Timmons at receiver. Going into November, the Wildcats were obviously 5-3, and they'd end up finishing the 2014 season on a 6-game losing streak, and would go 5-7 with a 2-6 mark in the conference. It was not a good year for Kentucky. The team that Kentucky ended up playing was Mississippi State, and oh boy, how things were different for the Bulldogs back in 2014. Going into the month of November, the Bulldogs were 7-0 with a 4-0 mark in the SEC, and Dan Mullen was really starting to figure things out. The Bulldogs had beaten 3 straight top 10 teams from late September to early October, and Dak Prescott was in the running for the Heisman Trophy. At the time, Dak was obviously their quarterback, Josh Robinson was the star running back, and Darunya Wilson ended up being the main target in the receiving game. You also had Chris Jones on the defensive side of the ball, and while Mississippi State got off to a tremendous start, they'd lose in a battle at number 5 Alabama and lose to number 19 Ole Miss, and they would miss out on the playoff and go 10-2 with a 6-2 mark, and then they'd lose to Georgia Tech in their bowl game. It started out so wonderful as they were as high as number 1, but they would falter a little bit towards the end of the year. Sticking in the state of Mississippi, let's talk about the Ole Miss Rebels. At that point in the year, the Ole Miss Rebels were also incredibly talented, as they were ranked number 3 in the country. Sadly, in the last week of October, they would lose on the road to number 24 LSU 10-7, so they would actually enter the month of November with their first loss of the year. Ole Miss at the time had their senior quarterback in Bo Wallace, their star running back was Jalen Walton, then you had guys like Vince Sanders, Evan Ingram, and Laquan Treadwell at the receiver spot. Ole Miss would then drop another game to number 3 Auburn in the first week of November and get blanked by Arkansas, before upsetting number 4 Mississippi State in the Egg Bowl, and then they'd get blown out by TCU. Ole Miss was 7-1 going into the month of November and finished at 9-4 with a 5-3 mark. They had a weird year as well. Going across the country, we had to talk about the Georgia Bulldogs. The Bulldogs were also having a tremendous season, as going into the month of November, the Dogs were 6-1 with a 4-1 mark in the conference. They had lost that early season battle on the road against South Carolina 38-35, but they had also beaten number 16 Clemson in a premier Week 1 matchup. At the time, Hudson Mason was the starting quarterback for them, and they were led by Nick Chubb, Todd Gurley, and Sony Michel at the running back position. They were completely dominant there, and then you had guys like Chris Conley and Malcolm Mitchell catching passes out of the backfield. Leonard Floyd and Lorenzo Carter on defense, and Georgia would actually end up losing to Florida in that first weekend of November, before finishing the season out with wins against Kentucky, number 9 Auburn, Charleston Southern, and then a loss in overtime to Georgia Tech. They'd then win their bowl game against Louisville, and Georgia go 10-3 with a 6-2 mark in the SEC, which was definitely a weird season for them looking back. Okay, so at the time, the Tennessee Volunteers were not as good as they are now. Butch Jones was really trying to get things going out in Rocky Top, and he still hadn't quite figured it out yet. Going into the month of November, the Vols were 3-5 and were 0-4 in the SEC. To be fair, 3 of the 4 teams they had played in the SEC were ranked inside the top 12, and the other was Florida, and they had that loss to Oklahoma early on, so it was a grueling schedule for them. At the time, Tennessee was led by Justin Worley and Joshua Dobbs at quarterback. Jalen Hurd was emerging as the star running back, and then guys like Pig Howard, Von Pearson, and Marquez North were the top receivers for the Volunteers. Tennessee would end up finishing the season on a high note though, as they would beat South Carolina in overtime, knock off Kentucky, and beat Vanderbilt, and get themselves to a 6-6 record with a 3-5 mark in the conference, where then they would go beat Iowa in the Tax Slayer Bowl. After going into the month of November 3-5, the Vols would finish the season 7-6, which was showing that Butch Jones was moving things in the right direction. Back in 2014, the Auburn Tigers looked a lot different than they do now. At the time, they were ranked number 5 in the country going into the month of November, and were currently 6-1. They had barely scraped out a win against South Carolina at home, And that was after a solid start to the season in which they had beaten Arkansas, number 20 Kansas State, and number 15 LSU. Their lone loss had come on the road against number 3 Mississippi State, and then going into November, they would beat number 4 Ole Miss, and then lose 2 straight games to A&M and Georgia, and then would lose to Alabama. They finished the regular season at 8-4 with a 4-4 mark in the conference, before losing to Wisconsin in overtime in the Outback Bowl. For Auburn at quarterback, you had Nick Marshall, who was coming off of his tremendous 2013 season. You had a 1,600-yard back in Cam Artis-Payne, and Sammy Coates was once again back at the receiver spot, and Chris Frost was manning the defense. Auburn had a great start, but did not finish strong. Vanderbilt football felt so much different back in 2014 than they are now. The Commodores have been decently competitive this year, but back then Vanderbilt was good old Vanderbilt. Going into the month of November, the Commodores were 2-6 with an 0-5 mark in the SEC. They had just lost by 10 points on the road to Mizzou, and their only 2 wins of the year came by 1-possession wins over Charleston Southern and UMass. They had not really been competitive in any other game they had played in, and Vanderbilt didn't have a lot of talent either. Former blue-chip quarterback Johnny McCrary was the guy playing quarterback, and the only decent dude they had on the roster was Ralph Webb, and Vandy's season wouldn't get any better. They'd get one more win against Old Dominion on November 1st, and then drop 3 straight games to Florida, Mississippi State, and Tennessee to go 3-9 with an 0-8 mark in the SEC. Vandy started out terrible and ended terrible. Going into 2014, the Missouri Tigers were going under the radar after they had surprised the world in 2013, making it to the SEC Championship. The team would end up having to reload, but by the time the month of November had happened, Mizzou was in a good spot. They were 6-2 with a 3-1 mark in the SEC, and that came after a solid start to the season. Despite losing to Indiana at home and getting blanked by number 13 Georgia 34-0, they had that big come-from-behind win against number 13 South Carolina, and had also beaten Florida and Vandy to get to that 6-2 mark. To finish the year, Mizzou actually ended up doing great, as they would then beat Kentucky, number 24 Texas A&M, Tennessee on the road, and Arkansas at home. The Tigers ended up going 10-2 with a 7-1 mark in the conference before losing to Alabama in the SEC Championship game. They then beat number 25 Minnesota in the Citrus Bowl, and after starting out 6-2, the Tigers would finish at 11-3. That team was headlined by Matty Mock at quarterback and a 1,000-yard rusher in Russell Hansbrough, superstar receiver Bud Sasser, and then guys like Marcus Golden and Shane Ray on defense. But first, let's hear a word from today's sponsor, MyBookie. Convicted as I am about a certain bet, be sure to place your bet with MyBookie. This season, MyBookie is pulling out all the stops with incredible promotions like a weekly risk-free boost on Thursdays where you can bet without a sweat. If your bet hits, you win big. If it doesn't, forget it. MyBookie will refund your wager. But that's just the beginning. MyBookie is giving away hundreds of thousands in prizes with their Super Survivor and Square contests. Get your entries now in for your shot at huge cash rewards. When you're ready to get started, be sure to use my promo code Fisher50 and make sure to get some extra cash on top of your first deposit. If you type in Fisher50, you'll get up to $1,000 in a welcome bonus bet plus a $10 casino chip. MyBookie's tiered bonuses make it easy to deposit with crypto or with credit, and the bigger your deposit, the bigger your bonus. The bonus would be 100% match up to $1,000 plus a $10 casino chip. With MyBookie, you can bet on anything, anywhere, at any time, and make your season a winning season. Be sure to check out my link down below and use my promo code Fisher50. Staying in the SEC East, we have to talk about the South Carolina Gamecocks. At this point in the month of November, South Carolina had almost gone on the road and upset number 5 Auburn, but they would fall just a little bit short. To start out the year, South Carolina lost to number 21 Texas A&M in the Kenny Trill game, and then after that, they beat number 6 Georgia in week 3, before then falling on some hard times. They lost to Mizzou, Kentucky, and Auburn, and they go into the month of November at 4-4. From there, they lose to Tennessee in overtime on the first weekend in November, and then would beat Florida in OT. They then beat South Alabama to get bowl eligible before getting beat by Clemson. The Gamecocks went 6-6 with a 3-5 mark in the SEC, before beating Miami in the Independence Bowl to finish at 7-6 overall. South Carolina at the time was led by Dylan Thompson, who was one of the best quarterbacks in the SEC. Mike Davis was the running back, and then Pharaoh Cooper was their superstar receiver, with Sky Moore being their defensive star. Once again, staying in the SEC East, we have to talk about the Florida Gators. Florida had had a weird season as their first game against Idaho was canceled, and then they would beat Eastern Michigan and Kentucky in 3 overtimes to start out 2-0. Their first loss would come on the road against Alabama, before they would then beat Tennessee by 1 point. They also had losses to LSU and Mizzou penciled between that, so going into the month of November, Florida was 3-3 with a 2-3 mark in the SEC. They'd really have to fix some things if they wanted to make a bowl game, and they'd start out strong with a win over number 11 Georgia, and then they'd beat Vanderbilt and Eastern Kentucky to get to a 6-4 record. Ultimately, they would lose by 5 points to Florida State, and then they would go beat East Carolina in the Birmingham Bowl. The Gators went 7-5 with a 4-4 mark in the conference, and at the time they're led by both Treyon Harris and Jeff Driscoll at quarterback, Matt Jones and Kelvin Taylor were the running backs, and DeMarcus Robinson was your main wideout for them. Arkansas was really trying to figure things out under head coach Brett Bielema, who started recruiting a decent amount of talent to Fayetteville. Arkansas was 4-4, and they had just taken care of UAB at home. To start out the year, they had lost to Auburn, but did get a decent win over Texas Tech on the road in Week 3. They lost in overtime to A&M, and also only lost by 1 point to Alabama. They are also competitive against Georgia, so while they were 4-4 and 0-4 in the SEC, Arkansas was still pretty dang good. To start out the month of November, they lose by 7 to Mississippi State, before knocking off number 17 LSU and a top 10 Ole Miss team, and my goodness, their schedule was difficult. They almost went on the road and beat Mizzou, but lost in the Battle Line game, and they'd ultimately go 6-6 with a 2-1 mark in the SEC, before knocking off Texas 31-7 in the Texas Bowl. After starting out 4-4 in the month of November, the Razorbacks would finish at 7-6. At the time, Brandon Allen was the quarterback, and then you had guys like Jonathan Williams and Alex Collins at running back, and Hunter Henry and Keon Hatcher were the top 2 wide receivers / pass catchers on the offensive side of the ball. Texas A&M had had a wild 2014 season, as they were just coming off of losing Johnny Football, and they would have to find a new guy at quarterback. Luckily, in Week 1 on that Thursday night game, they went on the road and beat a top 10 South Carolina team by way of over 500 yards from Kenny Hill, aka Kenny Trill. That legend was short-lived, as despite starting out 5-0, climaxing with a win over Arkansas, they would drop 3 straight games in the month of October to limp to 5-3 with a 2-3 mark in the SEC. Kenny Hill was now benched for Kyle Allen for the remainder of the year, and this would be enough to get them to a bowl game, as he would help them beat number 3 Auburn and Louisiana Monroe before they would lose to Mizzou and LSU, and then would beat West Virginia in the Liberty Bowl. A&M would end up going 8-5 with a 3-5 mark in the conference, and as I said, that quarterback position was interesting. Kenny Hill and Kyle Allen both took turns, Trey Carson and Trey Williams were the 2 main running backs, and then guys like Josh Reynolds, Malcolm Kennedy, Ricky Seals-Jones, and Speedy Noyle were the main receivers out of the backfield, and many were wondering if Kevin Sumlin was going to be on the hot seat. At this point in the 2014 season, LSU had faced off with number 3 Ole Miss, and had just knocked off a top 5 Rebels team. LSU was still under head coach Les Miles at the time, and things looked a little bit different for the Tigers. After beating number 14 Wisconsin in Week 1, they would drop a game in late September to Mississippi State and get blown out on the road by Auburn, and then after that win over number 3 Ole Miss, they'd be 7-2 going into the month of November. Sadly though, the month of November wasn't great for them, as they would then lose in overtime to Alabama, get shut out by Arkansas, and then would luckily bounce back with a win over A&M to get to 8-4 with a 4-4 mark in the SEC. They'd qualify to play in the Music City Bowl, where they would lose to Notre Dame 31-28. LSU at the time was led by quarterbacks Anthony Jennings and Brandon Harris. Leonard Fournette and Terrence McGee had broken out at the running back position, and at receiver you had guys like Trayvon Durrell, Malachi Dupree, and John Diarse. Finally, we get to the last team, and that is the Alabama Crimson Tide. At the time, Nick Saban was still running the show down in Tuscaloosa, and they were fresh off of a win over Tennessee, 34-20. 2014 was sort of a weird year for the Tide. They beat West Virginia in that Chick-fil-A kickoff game, and they would also take care of Florida by the end of September, but they lost on the road to number 11 Ole Miss. Bo Wallace was a legend that night as the number 11 Rebels knocked off the Tide, but then Alabama would rally. They beat number 21 A&M, and then went on the road and beat Tennessee to be 7-1 with a 4-1 mark going into the month of November. The month of November, they would really cruise as they beat 3 top 16 teams, including number 1 Mississippi State, number 15 Auburn, and number 16 LSU. Then they'd beat number 16 Mizzou in the SEC championship game. They are now 12-1 with a 7-1 mark in the SEC, and they go to the college football playoff where they lost by 7 points to number 4 Ohio State. After starting out 7-1, Tide would go 12-2 with a 7-1 mark in the conference. At the time, they were led by new starting quarterback Blake Sims, who threw for a school record 3,500 yards. Both Derrick Henry and TJ Yeldon had exploded at the running back position, and then Amari Cooper became one of the top receivers in college football that year. Then obviously the whole defense was loaded with talent. So yeah, that's what the SEC looked like back in 2014 as we entered the month of November. This video is going to go out literally at midnight on November 1st, so to me it's crazy that a decade has now gone by, and what do you guys think? What are your surprises from today's video, and what other topic or video like this should I do next? Be sure to let me know down below, leave a like if you want to support today's video, subscribe if you're new, and check out all of the videos on the end screen. Hope to see you guys again soon, but until next time, peace.